My name is Lennox, and this is Ordinary Gentlemen, where we endeavor to master the art of masculinity by building the virtues of strength, wisdom, and responsibility for the honor of God. Welcome back, gentlemen. Today I want us to discuss the idea that wokeness is unmanly. Another way of putting that is wokeness is effeminate. But as we begin, let's begin by defining what wokeness is. What does it mean to be woke? Well, to be woke is generally regarded as the ability to perceive oppression in society. So, by this definition, there's this assumption that there are people who are perpetually oppressed in society based on their ethnicity, based on their sex, based on a variety of other factors, their economic class, for example. And so being woke is to have this ability to perceive oppression. Now, I think that this does a great disservice to men. And this is something that we need to be aware of, and something that we need to have an argument against, and something that we need to be mindful of in order for us to not be corrupted by. Because I believe that wokeness is a poison that's in the village well. Many people are drinking from this village well, and so many people have this perception of the world. And so if we're going to be the kind of men God wants us to be, we need to be aware of this. And we need to know and figure out how we can strive against the current tide of wokeness that is, in fact, damaging the idea of masculinity itself. And so today I just want to give you 4 arguments for why I believe wokeness is, in fact, unmanly. And the first reason I want to give you is this. Wokeness is based on a lie. It is not based on the truth. Wokeness comes from an idea known as cultural Marxism. And basically, this idea posits that in the world, there are 2 kinds of people: those who are oppressed and those who are oppressive. And that society is this big dance that requires revolutions in order to balance off these discrepancies between those who are oppressed and those who are oppressive. And so cultural Marxism suggests a spectrum of ways that people are oppressed. So for example, white people would be considered those who are oppressive. Black people would be considered those who are oppressed. Women would be considered those who are oppressed. Men would be considered those who are oppressive. The poor or lower middle income people would be considered oppressed. Those who are wealthy would be considered oppressive. And that spectrum goes on and on. But this is not based on the truth. And I say that because this is, in fact, an atheistic idea. It throws God out of the equation entirely. Because God is not perceived to be the sovereign ruler of the earth, we're sort of left to ourselves to figure out who's going to determine truth. And the idea behind Marxism is that those who have the power are those who then can construct what truth is in society. Right? Now, this is a very dangerous way for us to think, because if we're going to live in this world in a fruitful fashion, we need to see this world for what it really is. In order for us to see the world for what it really is, we need to view it from the lenses of God. Right? We need to see reality as God sees it, as He perceives it. And a Marxist world is not the world that God created. And so Marxism is an elaborate lie that actually is intent on defying the truth. It's intent on defying God. And so if we as men are going to be everything that God wants us to be, we need to be people who understand what the truth is. And for as long as we believe the lies of wokeness, the lies of cultural Marxism, we will never live in reality in the way God wants us to live. The second thing I want to suggest about a way that wokeness is in fact unmanly is the fact that wokeness perpetrates a mentality of victimhood and entitlement. So if I think of myself as a victim, a perpetual victim, there's really nothing I think I can really do for myself, and I then feel entitled to be served and not have to do anything for myself. Right? Victimhood is something that has crippled the minds of whoever buys into it. To a large degree, the reason why Africa continues to be such a poor continent is because we have bought into a mentality of victimhood, where we think ourselves to always be oppressed and therefore cannot really do anything to thrive. We think that the system is naturally bent against us and that there's nothing we can do for ourselves to lift ourselves out of this position, because this is a perpetual sort of identity. And this is really crippling. And it then breeds things like overdependence. It then begins to foster a mentality of fatalism and of passivity. And this really flies in the face of what we're supposed to be as men who are builders of culture. We can't fulfill that cultural mandate to subdue and dominate the earth, to be fruitful and to multiply, if we think of ourselves as victims. This does us a great disservice. And for as long as you as a man think of yourself as a victim in any way, right? Maybe you might be a victim of your emotions, you're a victim of your mental health, a victim of whatever it could be. You're doing yourself a great disservice, because nothing can be built from that mentality. And so wokeness is unmanly because it perpetrates a mentality of victimhood. The third thing I want to suggest to you is that wokeness is unmanly because it prompts us to have to pander to whoever is perceived to be oppressed in society. So take, for example, feminism. Women are, in a Marxist framework, perceived to be oppressed, and men are perceived to be oppressive. And so in order to correct this, as men, we think then we have to dumb down our masculinity and elevate women in society, in most cases even above men. And so we'll always pander to the interests of women, rather than being the ones who guide, rather than being the ones who protect, rather than being the ones who provide. We then begin to pander to this group that essentially wants everything that men want. That's essentially what feminism tries to posit. And so wokeness does a great disservice to men in that regard, because it basically neuters them from being everything they're supposed to be. Right? We're basically weakened. We are essentially emasculated from doing what God wants us to do. Our strength, our sense of responsibility, our wisdom are things that the world wants to remove from us in order to weaken us, in order for this Marxist utopia of sorts to be established. And so that's the third reason. Wokeness is unmanly, because it prompts us to pander to groups that are perceived to be oppressed. And they become the authority over how we should live our lives as men rather than God himself. That's dangerous. The fourth and final reason I want to give you for why I believe wokeness is unmanly is that it prompts this idea of a big government which is emasculating to men. So in a woke mentality, you need an agent who's going to bring about some sort of balance between power structures. And in almost every case, that agent is perceived to be the state or the civil government. And so rather than having men in society, a woke mentality would have the government take the place of men, where the government now becomes the protectors, the providers, and the presiders of everyone in society in the name of enacting and enforcing justice. Right? It's a type of social justice that does us a great disservice, but that's the mentality behind wokeness. And so for as long as you buy into wokeness, you're actually conceding your power to another entity that, when they attain that power, will become destructive. And that's why as men, we've had less of a say in the things that happen in our society, in the social welfare of our society, because we have deferred that responsibility over to the state. And this is what wokeness is intent on achieving. It's intent on emasculating men from being the ones who provide, preside, and protect over their families, their churches, and society at large. And that responsibility is given to the government. And the bigger a government grows, the more men become emasculated. So we need to be aware of wokeness. We need to be aware of what it does, especially to us as men. We need to stop thinking of ourselves as victims. We need to stop thinking of ourselves as those who are toxic and those who are oppressors. And we need to recognize that God has a far higher calling for us. So I just want to briefly suggest to you a few ways that we can inoculate ourselves against wokeness. And the first thing I want to suggest is fear God. Fear God and believe in his all-sufficient, authoritative word. I say that because God is the truth. God is the standard of truth. And if we're going to defeat the lies of wokeness, we need to be equipped with the truth to discern the error of wokeness and to build and become everything that we're supposed to be as men. So fear God and believe in his authoritative word. The next thing I want to suggest to you is to learn sound theology. Learn what the world is supposed to look like in developing a biblical worldview. As we get a better understanding of what God's design is for his world, we can then begin to fruitfully fight against an idea like wokeness. The enemy wants to steal, kill, and destroy. We need to have a worldview that enables us to be fruitful and multiply. The last suggestion I want to give you is to assume responsibility for yourself and for those God has given you responsibility over. Right? This is where it all begins. I think that wokeness in a lot of ways begins with people who do not want to be responsible for themselves. People who do not want to be responsible for the well-being of their families, their churches, their communities. And so by you assuming responsibility as a man, you're not thinking of yourself as a victim. You understand that you have a role to play in building a culture that will glorify God, in building yourself in a manner that will glorify God. So assume that responsibility. Take ownership of your life. Take ownership of the people God has given you to care for. And I think when we do that, we'll be able to push against this tide of wokeness and become everything that we were commanded to be by God. So men, keep that in mind. Wokeness is in fact unmanly. This is something we ought to reject if we're going to be the right kind of men. If we're going to continue to develop our strength, wisdom, and responsibility in our duty to protect, provide, and lead. And men, as always, may we remain faithful rather than wanting.